Welcome to the session today, or our quick stop. Today we're going to be talking about kind of different myths involved with selecting a major or deciding on your major, and the same thing with your career. Myths related to pursuing a career path or changing a career path. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But just a quick introduction. My name is Rohit Prasad. I am the consultant for the College of Business here and one of the many career consultants on our campus. For anyone interested in seeing your career consultant, there is a consultant for your specific college. So there's one for health studies, one for arts and science, one for nursing, and so on. And so at any point you want to discuss these topics further, or if you just need some additional help with your development, I highly encourage you to reach out to our department through Handshake or schedule an appointment through Handshake, and we're more than happy to help you. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I'm going to break down the presentation in kind of two major parts. One's related more so with majors, and the other part more so with careers. And then I'll shift over to more common myths, and then as well as some Q&A, of course. So when it comes to major related myths, there's a lot that kind of comes through that we often hear from students, and that we hear from people who are prospective students as well when it comes to their major. But how can we kind of distinguish these two, and what are kind of, some are partially true, some are completely false, but I think it always helps to have some more context behind what they mean and the reality of what's going on. So the first one that I often hear is this feeling that everyone has it figured out in terms of their major and their career path. You know, I heard this multiple times. I myself felt that way when I was going through school, where it felt like everyone knew exactly what they wanted to do. They felt like they had a specialty. It seemed like it was for them, and I didn't, right? I was still kind of figuring out. I was changing my major. Even in grad school, I didn't have a specialty per se within the work that I do in education at that time. And so it was hard to feel motivated in some sense, because I guess it's difficult when it feels like everyone else has like this goal, this kind of purpose, and you are still kind of figuring it out. And I think the reality behind that is that it's not really true. There may be a couple of folks for sure who have like a goal, they've had it streamlined, they've always wanted to do that. There are those rare individuals, I think. But I think most people are always trying to figure it out. I think even people who think that they want to do something for sure often hit hurdles at some point that it's not what they want to do, or maybe it's not as easy as they thought. And so deciding on a major or deciding on a career path and that certainty that comes with it really isn't always there, even with people who are career professionals and who are in their line of work. You're not always going to feel that way as well, that kind of certainty. You know, things change. And I think that's just one thing to remember, is that it isn't just you. It is a very common feeling. One sec, let me just admit some folks in. Where did that go? Okay, never mind. I think they left. Sorry about that. But yeah, that feeling of uncertainty is very common. And this impression that we feel like everyone else has it figured out is really just an illusion. Oftentimes when you talk to those people in some more detail, or you talk to your friends in some more detail, you often come to the realization that they too are just trying to figure it out. You may be in different places in terms of figuring out, but there is often a great deal of uncertainty when it comes to selecting a major, or even feeling confident in your career choice. So that is something that is very common. Your major determining your whole life in terms of your career. I've had students who've had that feeling, and similar to the first one, it adds this kind of pressure because you don't want to get it wrong, right? A lot of people feel this pressure that I need to pick a major that fits me perfectly, and it's going to be exactly what I want to do for like the next 20 years, right? But the reality is careers don't really work like that. A lot of times you'll find that people will change their majors or change their minds in terms of career path. And we'll talk about those statistics in a sec. But more so when it relates to major and your career in terms of like a lifetime, that really isn't true. People change their careers pretty often. In a lifetime, it's around 3. Around 3, sometimes 4, people will change their career paths. And so this idea that your major fixates to what you're going to do really isn't true. It is true to some extent. So again, some context. If you want to pursue something that's a certified kind of work, so for example, teachers, you simply can't teach without a certification. That is one kind of exception. So certified fields, you do need to have some kind of education or credential to do that kind of work, but they're all alternatives. So for example, you don't necessarily have to go to a four-year university to be a teacher. You can go get an alternative certification process as well. And so there are more than one route to achieve a certain kind of career path. But you can also do a lot with your major. Majors are designed to be inherently rather broad. And so finding a career path often comes down to exposure to the field and your experience. So where have you done your internships? Where have you volunteered? Who have you spoken with, like in terms of professionals, right? Who's made an impact on your career path? Those are all things to factor in. It's kind of this idea that your major is very linear to your career isn't that true. A lot of people, if you go speak with professionals, I believe the percentage is like 65 or 70%. I might be a little bit off. People who are professionals, that's different from their original major, right? And so it's again very common that you do something that's different. Um, I should major in something I'm really good at. Now, I've heard this one a lot, particularly for people who are feeling uncertain about what they should pursue. A very quick thing, a very not necessarily easy thing is that you choose something that you're good at, right? Because that makes sense. I want to pursue a career where I think, I'm going to be successful. I should just choose something that I'm skilled at and that I'm good at, not necessarily something they enjoy. So this is kind of again one of those kind of half miss. Like again, there's context. So I do agree you should major in something that you're good at, but you shouldn't exclude everything else, right? Because you have 4 years, even sometimes longer, for pursuing a grad degree, or it can take a while if you're doing part time as well. That you have time to build up upon those skills. You're not expected to come in first semester as a professional. Otherwise, you'd be a professional in that field, right? When you're majoring something, think of it as an opportunity to grow in a skill set, not just to master something you've already mastered. It doesn't necessarily add a lot of skill set. Now, in some cases, people do pursue a degree so they can just get a credential. That is true. So for example, sometimes people who are already in their career paths who are just looking for a degree to move up in their field or to get upward mobility for another position, that may be the case. But so they may be majoring in something that they're already skilled at or something that they already do. But for many people, when you're first kind of considering your major, think about something in combination to what you want to do, right? It's not just something you're skilled at, because I've met a lot of people where they may be skilled at a particular thing, but they don't necessarily enjoy doing that. So for example, I am skilled at working with data. I like it was something I trained in terms of school. I've done those classes and those projects where you consult with outside organizations, but I don't necessarily enjoy doing that on a day-to-day for sure, right? That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to go major in mathematics or data analysis. So it's again kind of a partial truth. You may still use it, and it's something you may find that's handy from time to time, but it doesn't necessarily have to be your major for your whole time here, right? And the same thing applies to your career. Just because you think you ought to be in that and you're skilled in it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be something you have to pursue if you don't necessarily want to do that. It's again a combination of a lot of factors, and how those factors weigh out is different for everyone else. And I'm going to talk about kind of purpose and the idea behind that in a sec as well. This idea that adding more majors or minors makes you more marketable. That one I think is simply false. I don't think that one's like kind of in between. That one I do am of the opinion that it is simply false. So it is very common to graduate with simply just your major. So you have a bachelor's of arts or science in said major. Adding on minors, adding on certificates can help, but it is not required. There are many individuals who pursue a degree without adding additional, I don't know what exactly you would call them, but like minors and certificates to your degree. And it doesn't necessarily add a lot of value, unless it's something that they wanted to pursue, right? And so it may be marketable in the sense, let's say you want to get a certificate in technical skill set. So like earlier I was talking about data analysis, right? So if you want to get a certificate in data analysis so you can build up your skill sets in, for example, using Microsoft Excel or Tableau or, a program like that, that may help you if that's something that you want to pursue in the future, or it's relevant to the jobs you or careers that you're going to be applying for. Right. But in general, having, double majoring, double minoring, just because you're adding a lot doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make you the top candidate. Even in our office, we've interviewed PhDs before that have not gotten the job, and they were technically more qualified than anyone else on a technical level. But in terms of soft skills, in terms of interviewing skills, this didn't make the cut. Right. And so there's more to it than just those 2 lines of education on your paper. And I think one thing to also keep in mind is that it isn't just your degree, right? So your education, a lot of people think education is your main marketing point, and it is one, it is a qualification. But you should also keep in mind that you need to get some experience while you're here as well. It's education plus experience that really makes you marketable. Someone with just a degree, there's not as much to leverage as someone who has both the degree and is able to get some field experience, whether it's through internships, whether it's through externships, volunteering, whether it's through project-based work or consulting work through your classes. Those kind of things are what add marketability and skill sets to your kind of portfolio and your repertoire, not necessarily having an additional minor, right? So you need to think about what exactly is it that's going to make me more marketable and is going to make me a better candidate, right? Because it is a combination of things, education, primarily education and experience. And then another myth that I've heard, and this one I think I've heard a little bit more so, is this hesitancy to pursue a graduate program that's different from their undergrad. Right. So believe it or not, that in-between space of undergrad and grad school is a really good point to shift your career path if you want to. And so if you want to pursue a grad program that's very different than your undergrad, because the thing is, some people realize their junior or senior year that, you know what, I don't really want to do this. I don't think this is a good fit, but I'm already too far along. If I change my major now, I might have to take another 2-3 years, and I simply can't afford to do that. That's a reality. For many people. And so what can they do, right? So one option, for example, is a lot of students consider doing grad school. Even if you're considering a specialty and you're not doing, necessarily a field change, you can do something different, right? It's a good time to pivot, because a lot of grad school applications, they don't necessarily require that you have direct exposure to that specialty. It may be part of it, for specifically MBA programs, those might. But in general, they may typically ask you examples of work and skill sets that they're looking for. So for example, you're applying to a research-based position, more than likely they're going to ask you for an example of your written work in some way. And you can use different examples. You can use examples from undergrad, you can examples from work if you have permission. So that really just kind of depends, but it's a really good pivot point. And if that's something that's the situation you're in, like you're just too far along, you can't make a change, but you're thinking about grad school, you can pursue something different if that's the route you want to go. So for example, like I oversee business in terms of career consulting. And so I'll meet with students who think that they have to pursue an MBA because that's what they got their undergrad in, is that they got their undergrad in business. But they don't have to. If you have an interest in something else, or let's say you work in a slightly different field than business, and you just found that you just really like the kind of work that you've done while you're in undergrad, and you want to do something more in line with that, you might pursue that. Can y'all still hear me fine? I got a little message on my screen that says my internet connection is unstable. I don't know if that's affecting the webinar. Okay.
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, that's another myth that I've come across. So what questions do you have at this point, if there are any, or anything you'd like to add? Any maybe that you've heard of when it comes to selecting a major? Have y'all heard of these before? Have these come across? Are these myths that you yourself have heard of or perhaps even believed at some point?
Yes, even as a older returning student, I look around and sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, these younger people have everything together. They know exactly what they're doing. They're like totally on top of it. And so I'm glad to hear that it's just a myth and not everybody is.
Yeah, and they also, I think a counter argument is, or not necessarily counter argument, but just a counterpoint is that they often feel the same way about older students in reverse, that they're the ones who are lost and older students have it figured out, like they're adults as they kind of think, like, I'm the one who's lost and they have it figured out. And so they feel kind of the same thing, just in another direction as well. So it's not, for example, unique to either one. Both people of any age can experience that feeling. Absolutely. Anything else anyone would like to add at this point? All right. So one quick statistic I forgot to mention, but when it comes to, for example, selecting a major, a lot of people think that people don't change their majors that often, or they might feel hesitant about changing their major. Statistically speaking, about 30% or about 1/3 of students change their major at least once. A lot of people think that they come in, you select a major, and you're just stuck with it for a while, or just stuck with it, that you have to just stick with it. You really don't. Now, there are factors you may have to consider at junior or senior level when changing your major, because it can affect your timeline. But as a freshman or sophomore, changing your major is relatively easy. It's typically just signing a form. Um, and so if you are considering changing your major, always talk to the advisor that you're wanting to change into. They can usually give you more precise advice as to that new degree plan as well. So yeah, that's something that people do. People change their majors. It's part of it. Um, all right. So shifting over to the other piece, the career relatedness. So these are a little bit kind of transitional as well as related to the career path itself. So I talked about this one a little bit earlier, but this idea that your degree is enough to land the dream job, right? I think oftentimes people don't realize that where you want to be is further down the road than they may think. Now, for some people, it may be more immediate, like it's an entry level position. But for example, I've heard people say that they want to be a director, they want to be a CEO, they wish to, be a manager or a leader. That's very common, right? And so the degree alone is not enough. I'm here to tell you that. If no one told you that, I'm telling you that. Your degree alone is almost never enough. The thing is, your degree is a credential. It is one credential that adds to your repertoire, but it is not everything. Because you have to remember, there's a lot to consider in terms of, for example, on an employer side. Education is a qualification, it is a credential, but it is no replacement for experience and vice versa. They both complement each other, right? And so you need to have experience in order to do well oftentimes. And a lot of companies are using programs. So for example, you may see like leadership programs, manager and training programs, administrative fellowships. Um, the same kind of on the flip side in research and fields in the sciences, you may see fellowships, grants, things like that, that are more like pipelines in some way, that they use those pipelines often as a way to recruit students into full-time professional positions to get them on their career path essentially. But this idea that you can just hop from your initial degree, graduate, and then start that high level C-suite job really isn't a reality. So it's important to keep timeline in mind a bit, that you're playing a long game. Your degree does help, and it helps kind of speed things along a bit, but it's not like a wonder potion that's gonna make you skip 20 years ahead of time. It really doesn't work like that. You still need to go through the process. You still need to put in years. You still need to work your way up to some degree. And so it is again, it's not a replacement. And that's one thing I think is important. Even if your degree doesn't require that you get to do an internship, this is another thing that I've heard, is that, well, I don't need to do an internship, like it's not required. I really don't care if it's required or not. I encourage it anyways, because the employer, the path you're on, they're not going to care whether it was on your degree or not. You know, what your degree plan said, they're not going to care whether they required it for your degree program or not. The point is that they require it, that they need experience, right? And so that's I think one thing to keep in mind. The other is that you can't apply for a job unless you meet all the qualifications exactly. So that you meet all the minimum qualifications and you meet all the preferred qualifications. You know, I've seen this kind of hesitancy from students in the past. I encourage you to apply anyways. So if you meet all the standard qualifications or the minimum qualifications, and it's something you're interested in that you think you'd be a good fit for, apply anyways. If you don't meet all the preferred qualifications, that's a-okay. That's, you can still apply. Again, those are preferred qualifications. If you have them, it certainly helps. If you don't, you can still apply and they can still consider you, because more than likely there are other things you can leverage. So for example, myself, like when I applied for a student affairs position, I did not have a ton of student affairs positions prior to grad school, right? And so even among like grad school and the qualifications for that, I did not come from student affairs. I didn't do orientation or transfer, none of that, right? And so, but you're able to leverage your past experiences and talk about transferables, transferable skills specifically. And that helps you bridge some of those preferred qualifications. And depending on where you apply, they may consider certain experiences as equivalent. And that really kind of varies. The government in particular has very specific ideas of equivalencies when they look at qualifications. So that one is a little bit more specific. But in general, depending on how you talk about your experiences and where your experiences have been, and you focus on the transferables, you often can meet the preferred qualifications to a certain degree. But if you meet the standard or the minimum qualifications, still apply if that's something you're interested in. Just because you don't meet all the preferred doesn't mean it's off the table completely. It's still something that is a viable opportunity. All right. It's too late to change careers. You know, I was working with a student once back when I was a TA at UTD, and she was about like 70 years old, and she was a fantastic student, but she pursued education because she wanted to have a degree. She wanted to get an education because she hadn't gotten one earlier in life. But I think it really reinforces this fact that you don't have to necessarily be a certain age to go to college. That I think is becoming less and less the case in terms of like this idea of a traditional student is kind of changing, because more and more people are going to college kind of across the board. And so it's something I would say that it's definitely not too late to change careers. In a lifetime, like I mentioned earlier, it's 3 to 7 times. So depending on the research and the study that you're looking at, people will change their career paths 3 to 7 times. And it's okay. That's the thing. So here's the reality of like having a career. People think that I'm going to choose a career path, I'm going to be in it, I'm going to love it till the day I die. Not really. Like that is rare. That does happen sometimes where you'll see people who will stick through it for decades, but they are extremely rare. For the most part, many people, what happens is they will find other opportunities. Maybe a friend refers them to something else. They hear about something else that just seems fascinating, or maybe they get referred to do another kind of or a line of work that might be a good fit. Another very common thing is that you simply get bored, to be honest. Like once you've done that enough and you're kind of what you would consider a subject field or a subject matter expert in what you do, your work can become very quickly boring. And so you may want to change your career. That, you know, I've kind of done this. I've learned all I can really, and I'm kind of plateauing, and I want to do something else. And that's perfectly okay. That's a perfectly normal feeling to have, to want to change your career path. Thank you. And so it is never too late to change your career. You know, I've spoken with students who have been on the board of directors and they are midway through their career and want to go even further, but simply don't want to do that kind of work anymore and want to transition to something else. And so they may be getting a degree to do that. They may be getting a certificate to change their skill sets a little bit, right? But that's still possible. You know, I would say it's definitely not too late. And it is very common for people to change their careers. All right. If you have a passion for your work, you will never work a day in your life. I used to hear this all the time. It is the biggest lie I've ever heard in my life. Um, I think it's actually quite the opposite. You know, if you're really passionate about your work, you really enjoy your work, if anything, you push yourself harder to be better at it, right? It is not an easy thing. Sure, you may get used to it. You may, in a sense, know what to say after a while. But if it's something you're really passionate about, you tend to invest more time into it than the average individual. So if anything, I'd argue that you're going to work even harder for something you're passionate about. You know, it's kind of, think about the opposite. So think about a job you don't really care about. Are you really going to put in that much effort? Probably not. Or something you just don't really care about. You're just not going to put in as much effort. But if it's something you really care about, something you're really passionate about, something you really want to do, you're going to do even more, right? So this idea that you're never going to work a day in your life, it is tiresome work. It, you know, some days it, you know, there's why you have these talks about burnout with educators and social workers, people that are in the services field. Oftentimes, this whoa, can y'all still hear me? It said I was signed out, and I just want to make sure this session's still working.
I can still hear you.
Okay, fantastic. But yeah, this idea that you're never going to work a day in your life is such a lie. It's the opposite. I found it in my experience, and often people who I've spoken with who feel like they have a sense of passion and purpose, it is quite the opposite. Career advancement will occur naturally over time. I also think that is kind of false. It does occur naturally in the sense that you are gaining experience, but in terms of advancement, it's something you want to advocate for and push for, right? Are you having purposeful conversations with your supervisor about what you can be growing in, right? Are you talking to maybe the director of your office, or maybe talking to your coworkers or other people on staff on how or what you can do to reach that next level if you want to pursue that? Or let's say you want to pursue something different. Are you looking into those opportunities actively? And I don't just mean job searching. Are you doing your research? Are you talking to people within that field? Are you learning more about that job before you've even started it? So for example, I have an interest in financial literacy. That doesn't mean I'm going to wait for financial literacy to come knock on my door and be like, hey, here's a job in financial literacy. No, like, it's up to me to learn more about those opportunities, to learn more about that content area, right? And so this idea that advancement just happens magically really doesn't occur. You need to proactively be a part of that advancement. How are you yourself pushing for advancement within your role, within your conversations, within what you're learning, right? Those are things you need to think about. All right, so another kind of stopping point. So things that you've heard before, I imagine you probably heard the passion one before for sure. But any of these sound familiar? Any of these you're like, you know what, I really didn't think of it like that, or these sound like that really resonates with me? Anything or any comments at this point?
I'm glad that you mentioned the one about applying for a job unless you meet all the qualifications exactly, because I think it's interesting when, when you look at a job description or, a job posting and you're like, oh, this sounds really good. I feel like I could do it. And then you get down to the qualifications and you're like, I don't have what they're asking for. So I'm glad that you mentioned like leveraging what you do have to bring to the table.
Yeah, and even when it comes to their minimum, let's say you're only off by like a year. Like, let's say they're asking for 2 years of experience and you maybe only have like 1 or maybe 1.5. You're just not quite there yet. Apply anyways. Like, honestly, those things are rather flexible, particularly in the private sector. Um, it often depends on if you can just make the argument. And oftentimes, depending on the case, by the time you graduate, by the time that offer technically begins, you may be at that point where you would be qualified, right? So for example, a lot of positions look for someone who has a degree already, like they've graduated. But if you're applying your senior year, by the time you probably start that position, you would have had your degree. And so you can actually apply for those positions, right? So you need to keep also in mind the start date or when they expect you to kind of begin, because that can also change the qualifications for you. So that's one thing to also keep in mind. All right. So kind of the last thing here, what are some career tips that you're kind of unsure about? Maybe you've heard about them and you're like, you know what, that kind of sounds right. It kind of doesn't. I'm just really not quite sure. Some two things that I've heard personally is that your career should be a perfect fit. Like I want to find something that's perfect for me. And that is very rarely possible. In fact, I'd argue it's impossible, um, because your career, there's often some compromise. You know, ideally, you're going to like most of what you do, but there's going to be some aspect you don't. Like, for example, earlier I mentioned I don't really enjoy working with data or doing that piece specifically, but it's part of my job. Even as a career advisor, it's something that I do. Um, and it's a compromise, right? And so does it affect my whole job? Like, does it make me completely unhappy? No, of course not. But it should be, it's the one thing to remember that every tiny negative doesn't necessarily mean that, you know what, this job's the worst. This is not what I should be doing. Like, I need to find something where it's perfect, like it's me. And it's for the most part you, but this idea that there's going to be a perfect role for you is very rarely, if not impossible, to be honest. And so I think the reality of that there's some compromise to positions is also something to consider. I hear a lot about mixed advice on cover letter length and resume length. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, Maria?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I've heard a lot of mixed advice about that, depending on what kind of job you're applying for. I've heard academia um, is more flexible with the length and that you can go longer. But at the same time, you don't want to be rambling on and on. So it's kind of strange.
Yeah, so a lot of this honestly depends on circumstance. So I'll try to divide up the circumstance as best I can. So for professional jobs, I recommend a single page resume. For most people, 2 pages if you have more than 5 years of a direct experience or a master's degree or higher. But for many students, so if you have a bachelor's in a couple years, a single page will be fine. Um, Cover length, same thing, a single page. Most of a cover letter, honestly, is just structure, like the letterhead, their address, your signature. That's like half of it, to be honest. The other half is your 3 paragraphs in the middle. But a single page and not going over that typically is not needed. So a single page on both typically, the exception being if you possess a graduate school degree or higher, as well as extensive direct experience. But for most people, lean toward a page on both. So that's like, I would say, the professional side. With the ones where you're hearing about more page length, that often comes up in academia because they'll often use the word resume and CV interchangeably, which is curriculum vitae, which is like an academic record. And so in academia, if you're pursuing a research, particularly if you're pursuing a PhD, or you're more extensively working within research, they use what's called a CV or curriculum vitae, which is very similar to a resume, but it's far more extensive in the sense it's like a record of everything they do. Classes they teach, papers they've written, presentations they've done, conferences they have attended, memberships they have, service to the community. So it lists more things specific to their field, and so that's why it tends to be longer. There is no real page limit on curriculum vitas. It is frankly just like a record. And so you'll meet some people who are starting out who may just be at a page, 2 pages, versus other professors who have like 6, 7 pages. You know, there's no real limit to a curriculum vitae, but it should still be organized and structured very well. That part really isn't an exception. So you'll see that in academia. With a cover letter, this really isn't the case when you're, so for example, when you're applying for grad school, they'll ask you oftentimes for a cover letter or a personal statement. And so in this case, I would usually, unless they specifically say like a cover letter, I would lean toward a page almost always. But if they use something more kind of flexible, like a statement of purpose or a teaching things like that. So whenever they use something that's not technically a cover letter, but a personal statement is usually more common for grad school, it's very similar to a cover letter, to be honest. Similar types of content in some ways, but those can be about 2 pages. And so some schools ask for like a hybrid of the two, and it's kind of in between. It's not necessarily a letter, but it's not necessarily a statement. It's, sometimes it's like a purpose statement or a letter of intent. A letter of intent is very similar to a cover letter as well, in which case it'd be about a page. But any time where it seems more like an essay where you're explaining your story a bit more, that's usually around 2 pages. But unless stated otherwise, I would never go beyond 2 pages for most documents at all. So my own resume would never be beyond 2 pages. My cover letter, no matter what I'm using it for, probably would never go beyond 2 pages, even if I'm applying for school, unless they stated otherwise. So if they have a specific requirement like, hey, you need to submit 3 pages of your writing work or a writing sample, that would be an exception. But a rule of not going beyond 2 is ideal. Lean toward 1, but don't go beyond 2. That's kind of like a good rule of thumb. I know that's a long answer, and I apologize for that, but it's different for depending on what you're using it for.
Oh, it's very helpful. Thank you.
But yeah, in general, lean toward 1, but never go beyond 2 if possible. Other things that you've heard that you're just not quite sure about, you're like, oh, that kind of sounds kind of right. Or maybe you heard it from a professor, maybe you heard it from like a friend, and you're like, that sounds solid, but let me just run it by someone else. In the meantime, another thing I've heard is that money shouldn't be a factor. Just pursue your passion. That I also think is incorrect. I think it's ideal if you can pursue your passion and make money through doing that. But honestly, that is not a reality all the time, right? Money is a factor. Let's be honest. We all go to school so we can have a better, what is it called? A better something of life. I forget what it's called. Standard of life? Something like that. But basically, a lot of people go to school so that you can make more money and have a better standard of living. That's what it is, standard of living. And so it is a factor. It does help, and it does kind of change what you choose. And that's the reality of it. To act like money is not a factor, I think, is hogwash. Like, of course it's a factor. So to pretend like it isn't, like it doesn't affect what you do is also, I think, incorrect. It is definitely a factor. Should it be the sole factor? No. That part I don't agree with. Like, it should never be the sole factor for why you do something. But to act like it's not an inherent reason of why you're here is not true. And so, yeah, it's not just, oh, choose your passion and you'll figure out the rest. And it's like, it's not that easy. So yeah, it is okay if money is a factor and it's something you're factoring into your choices, because that's the reality of what you have to live with, right? And so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That, excluding it as a factor, I think, does you a disservice. It should be something you consider. If there is nothing else, no questions, nothing anyone would like to add at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.